Today, I'm going to talk about how unsustainable things are seductive. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. When I say that unsustainable things are seductive, what I mean is that they seem to offer more than is really there, that by being unsustainable, they offer greater amounts of happiness or life or energy or achievement or whatever it is. And I'm going to talk about sort of the range that this goes over. But that they offer these things, they seem to offer these things as the real path to happiness. And they are in fact a path to misery. So I'm going to start with a particular example to really show what I mean by this. So take your prototypical rock star. I mean, obviously these days rock stars are, in more pop genres, etc. Rock as such is something of a niche genre, but pop stars generally. And what do? You'll notice, by the way, that for the most part, they are young. I will get to older rock stars in a little bit. But for the most part, they're young. They start off very young. They start off, as the young typically are, as being, physically pretty. They haven't, been weathered by age. They haven't been weathered by, living. They preach a life of living hard, of drinking lots of alcohol and doing lots of drugs and doing lots of fornication and partying all the time and really enjoying life. And they sort of will have a tendency to embody this, and this works for a number of years. And if they have a particularly good run, they'll be there for about 10 years, maybe something like that, maybe a little bit longer. It's very, very rare they're more than 20 years. It exists, but it's extremely rare. And so what happens, once they start to get older, once they start to see the ravages of this, once they start to have all of the problems associated with doing large amounts of drugs and drinking large amounts of alcohol and not getting enough sleep and spending all your time partying instead of doing things that will actually improve you mentally and so on, they start to deteriorate. They start to feel empty. And you will actually find a lot of these people, interestingly enough, when you're talking like 30 years down the line from like when they were young and popular, talking about how they're wiser and about how they were foolish when they were young, but nobody particularly hears them because they've been replaced by the next crop of young people who are preaching the same basic message of live for today. There's actually that great song, Sha-la-la-la-la, Live for Today, that kind of embodies it. Not a very good song, which is highly fitting. But, so you see that structure of it within rock stars. Like, look up who the pop stars are. Look up who the pop stars were 20 years ago. They're still around. I mean, they were young 20 years ago, and these days they're not doing very much. They're not very much in the spotlight. They don't have the same sort of general appeal. And, whoever you look up from back then, who, thing like, especially like if you're looking at like the sex symbols, the young people who didn't wear very much clothing and talked about how great a time that they're having and so on. When you look at them today, they're almost invariably not all that physically appealing. Sometimes, they were decent looking people, so they don't look like horrific now. But at the same time, they often don't look very impressive at all. And here's the thing, this is kind of generally true. There are a few minor exceptions. There are some people who just keep on looking good all the time. There are people who can look good in a more mature age. They can look good for their age, which is a different factor. But what goes on here? So I'm now going to be generalizing from this a little bit to, not fully generalizing yet, but generalizing a little bit to really show what I'm talking about. So, when a person's in their 40s, with a lot of work and, makeup and taking really good care of yourself and so on, you can still kind of pass for 20. Like the top 1% of the population in their early 40s can still pass for their, for being roughly in their 20s. They can still look generally vibrant and healthy. Once you start hitting 50, basically nobody can do that anymore. You find nobody in their 50s who will pass for being in their 20s. And I'm talking about, the top 1% of the population in terms of looking youthful in your older age. Most people at 40 do not look like they're in their 20s. Most people in their 40s look like they're, well, in their 40s. Now, what happens then? This is somewhat more important for certain types of things like, say, sex appeal. So, like, if the type of social power that a person's trading on, especially is being like a young woman, a young, slim, attractive woman. Once she's starting to look like she's in her 40s, she doesn't look like a young woman anymore. She might still be reasonably slim, but she doesn't look young anymore. And especially once a woman very clearly looks postmenopausal, there's a kind of fascinating thing that what she's really trading on in her youth is the potentiality that she can bear children. She can bear, presumably, extremely, not only healthy children, but beautiful children. Children who are very gifted, presumably, because they're going to inherit, half of their genetics from her and all of their epigenetics from her. And so there's sort of this promise that she has a tremendous amount of potential here. And this is despite the fact that sex is largely sterilized within our culture, a lot of what's being traded on there. And that particular thing, and again, I'm using this sort of particular to talk about more general things, because there's stuff that applies equally well to men. I'm just using the particular example. Women can, through a lot of work and a lot of luck, sometimes on occasion look in their 40s kind of still like they're in their 20s, like they have that sort of promise, kind of. Once they hit, basically once a woman turns postmenopausal, however, there are a bunch of physical changes that happen during menopause, and it becomes very, very clear that a postmenopausal woman has precisely none of that promise. She cannot bear children anymore. She has none of that reproductive power. She cannot pass on her good genetics and her good epigenetics to her children anymore because she's not having any children. And so what is life like for that woman when she hits her 50s? Because she's still going to live for decades longer, on average. And so what sort of life is there for her? If her life has been up to that point entirely based around the power of that potential for having children and passing on all of her beauty and health and whatnot. Well, now that she's no longer reproductive age, what the heck does she have? She can't really offer that. She can't offer that promise. She can't even offer that illusion in the modern sterilized sex thing, because people are trading on the illusion, even though they just use contraception to make sure that, in fact, they never will have any children. Well, what's going to happen? She kind of has nothing to fall back on. What does she have? Why does anyone care about her at this point? She's got nothing more to offer of the sort that she had been. All of the relationships up till now that she had built are all built on this sort of promise, on this sort of power, on being nearby to this sort of power and so on. And now that she doesn't have it anymore, what has she got? Contrast this with somebody who has taken the much less glamorous route of finding a husband and having children together. So you've got the husband in this case, you've got the children that she's having together. Having children has a tendency to bring you into contact with a bunch of very stable relationships, including it tends to pull you in directions of like having stable relationships with certain kinds of friends who are going to stick around. Also, especially friends who also have children like you. And you'll tend to form these friendships also from practical reasons. Like, people with children often need help, and so having friends really helps in that regard. You just naturally tend to form these sorts of more stable relationships with people because the sorts of things you have to offer and the sorts of things that you need, so there's reciprocal relationships that you build up, are not of the sort that are going to disappear on you. They're built to some degree on the fact that that you've helped people tends to make them want to help you in turn. And so as you do this, as you build up these relationships, as you help things like nieces and nephews and so on, you're building up these stable relationships that when you hit your 50s and you look like you're in your 50s, and here I'm still sticking with the woman who, now postmenopausal, isn't going to have any more children, but she has several children, and she has spent her time not with people having a good time, but rather building things like these sort of long-term relationships that actually last, having spent a lot of her time just doing things for other people. And so what is this sort of, woman who is now aging into the role of being matriarch? What is her life like? Well, she's got a whole collection of stable relationships that are built around things that have not in any way disappeared. She is still who she was. She is still generous and kind, and she still has wisdom. She has more wisdom to pass on now than she ever did before, and she is enmeshed in these just simple reciprocal relationships where she just spent time on people, and so they spend time on her, and so long term, her life is vastly more happy in this because she didn't take the short route. She took sort of the route that lasts vastly longer. Now, there are very much equivalents that happen with men too. This one just happens to, it has some very obvious built-in symbolism, which is why I went for it. You find similar sorts of things. I mean, you can find exactly identical things, basically. If you have a man who just spends all of his money on girlfriends, for example, and that the relationships he builds up are based basically on spending money on girlfriends who eventually get tired of him and leave him, he will have built up nothing. He'll have kept on getting the enjoyment of developing new relationships. He will get that initial attraction because he's got the money to spend, etc. But all that money spent hasn't built anything. It's all very transitory. It's all stuff that disappears, whether you're taking vacations or dining at restaurants or whatever. That doesn't go anywhere. Contrast this with, like, I spent a bunch of money to build a tool shed so I can store a bunch of my tools and have easy access to them and do stuff with that. And that money that I spent is useful. I plan fairly soon to be finally, finishing the project I've had for a while to build some bookshelves for my wife. And again, like, this money that I will be spending is going to produce things that stick around and continue to give benefit. There'll be things to show for doing this sort of stuff. Now, is spending money on building bookshelves for somebody the sort of thing that, like, gets people really excited about you, that gets people talking about how wonderful you are? No. It isn't. Even less, even to so much more degree, is like doing the dishes. They're dirty dishes, taking them, putting them in the dishwasher and running the dishwasher. Is that the sort of thing that will get anyone fawning over you? No. Not even a little bit. But you know what happens when you do that time after time after time after time? You have benefited somebody else in a way that produces that sort of reciprocal relationship. And you should be doing this in general out of a sense of generosity. But the thing is, it still is enmeshing you in these relationships that are the sort of thing that last. Because when a person has, over the years, consistently taken time simply to do you good in a way that doesn't really get them very much of anything, you develop loyalty. And that's the nature of human relationships in general. That if you do, the quiet stuff is the stuff that builds long term. The flashy stuff, the really flashy stuff, is enjoyable in the moment, but not very much comes of it. Now, so taking these things and now going a little bit more abstract. Taking the example of like the rock star. Now, most of us can't be rock stars. Or pop stars. Most of us will never have the opportunity to be a pop star, and so having a basic game plan of turning down being a pop star for having an actually decent life is not much of a sacrifice and pretty darn easy. But there are a lot of other things that are analogous to this. So, for example, like going on vacations. Now, there's nothing wrong with going on vacations. The occasional vacation, especially that doesn't cost too much money, is an entirely reasonable thing and can be very good. There can be, real benefit to be gotten out of it. To go, you want to go see a cathedral, in Europe, or you want to go see, natural wonder of the world, like you want to see the Grand Canyon, or you want to canoe down the Amazon River, whatever it is. Seeing the works of God, seeing the works of man, these things can all, inform the soul and give you benefit. Just spending some time in a nice place can even, it's cold where you are, you want to go to the Caribbean for a little bit, just to enjoy the warmth and sort of recharge and help you get through your own normal life. Again, reasonable. But there is an entire thing within our culture of the idea of living for these vacations, that like the whole purpose of everything you do is to be able to travel, because travel is what makes you a real human being, and so on. And what is this doing? It is trading on moments that cannot be sustained in order to try to bring you happiness. It's literally exactly what it's doing, because you can't afford to always be on vacation. If you could, it wouldn't be vacation. It would just be normal life. And so that's an example of where the idea is that life consists of these flashes of it. And now you especially see this sort of thing. Social media, it's not really anything new to see this stuff. We've had, television and radio before that, and travel writing before that. People talking about their amazing exploits and people thinking, wow, if only I lived that sort of life, is in no way new. Social media does, however, make this even more obvious and even more apparent, where people talk about the amazing things that they're doing, the wonderful experiences that they're having, and they show you just little snapshots, little brief 1-minute videos of this, and don't tend to show you nearly as much of all the downtime that isn't so interesting that they're having. But also what they don't show you is what their life is like in 10 years. Now, a really good example of this, by the way, another good example of this, comes up a lot in fitness type stuff. I happen to have been doing a bunch of research into weightlifting and figuring out how to optimize the programs that I'm using and the patterns of lifting weight to get stronger and so on. And so I've been doing a bunch of learning. So I've come across a whole bunch of different things, looking on YouTube, and I haven't really been on Instagram, but it's even more so from all the references I've seen of it. And you come across a lot of people who live in a very unsustainable manner, where look at how the top athletes live. And it doesn't matter basically what the sport is. You can look to gymnastics, swimming, running, weightlifting, powerlifting, no matter what it is. Look at the really top athletes. And what are these people doing? Well, they're pushing themselves to the very edge of human performance. And there's a problem with being on the very edge of human performance, and that is you are riding the very edge of what the human body is actually capable of doing. And you tend not to be able to do that for all that long, for one of two reasons. Either A, you will tend to go just a little past it and injure yourself, or two, you are simply running yourself past what your body is actually capable of dealing with. And so what you see really surprisingly commonly is people who were at the very edge of performance, the very highest athletes, end up just having all these horrible wear and tear issues. And later in life, they can barely, so many of them, when you look at them, just have trouble moving in normal ways, even. Just an example that comes to mind, because I happen to have seen it recently, was the legendary weightlifter Ronnie Coleman, or bodybuilder Ronnie Coleman. But I mean, the man lifted amazing weights. And he was unbelievable in his prime. But I saw a documentary of him now, and I mean, he's walking around on crutches. I mean, he still lifts weights, and he still lifts surprisingly heavy things for a man who literally walks around on crutches because it hurts too much to walk normally. But yeah, it hurts too much to walk normally for him, because the amazing stresses that he placed on his body over time just wore stuff down. And so you see that a lot. You see that an astonishing amount of where that happens to people at that very ragged edge of performance. And time after time, you see them talk about how, I'm dedicated, my life is about being the very best. I'm dedicated to being the very best. And it sounds great until you sort of put it together with okay, but that's going to stop sometime in your 30s or 40s. What about the rest of your life? And to some degree, a lot of them will tell you, and especially in the time, that whatever the rest of my life is, However bad that is, it's a trade-off I'm willing to make for being the very best there is right now. And I mean, it's your life, so you can make whatever decisions you want. I don't know why that caveat is necessary these days. Well, I sort of do. But anyway. But yeah, it's their life. They get to choose. They can make bad decisions if they want to. Fine by me. Don't need my permission for it. But it is kind of seductive. It sounds good. It sounds like, oh, here are the people dedicated to excellence. Here are the people who are really striving to be fully human. And no, they're not actually. And here's the relevant thing. This is where it is, why it is so important. They can make whatever decisions they want with their life. They can throw away the last 40 years of their life for having, a good decade or two if they want to. Especially if we're talking about using things like steroids, which tends to just straight up tends to destroy your health. Every once in a while, there's some exception who can just stand it all. But, for any given person, the odds of you being that exception are pretty darn small. And you only find out by doing it. You only find out how you respond to steroids and how much they wreck your health by taking steroids and seeing how much your health gets wrecked. For some people, not at all. Not many. For most people, a lot. For some people, it's in the point of major internal organ failure. Anyway, the point here being, they can make whatever choice they want, but there is something, and they may not be preaching it. And it's not relevant here whether they're preaching. I'm not trying to criticize the people as such. What I'm trying to say is that intrinsically, their search for excellence in this way is seductive. You see them striving for excellence like this. And since, if you're not a cramped, miserable soul, you too want excellence. You want to be, in this sense of the Greek arete, the excellence, true, perfection of the soul. You want that, and that's good. And you see these people who are striving for it, and they're striving really hard for it, and it's really seductive. Oh, that's how I should be doing it. And it almost never is. It almost certainly is not how you should be doing it, because the thing that they're doing is not sustainable. And now this is intrinsically structured this way, basically, that the very peak of output is always going to be something that exceeds the abilities of the system to keep up with it. You will always go fastest in a car if you flat out, if you push the gas pedal all the way to the floor and just leave it there, and eventually the engine climbs up into the red zone. And that will be its maximum power output. You will go, in the sense of fastest, you'll be going the absolute fastest. You'll be accelerating the hardest at that. But the problem is you are also generating heat in excess of the ability of the system to dissipate it. And for a little while, you can sustain that. You can sustain that, continuing with the car metaphor, because there's thermal mass in the engine. And so the colder parts of the engine can soak up heat from the hotter parts of the engine as you're putting more heat than the engine can overall dissipate. And so, the cooling system will soak up a little bit of that. And so there's thermal capacity, and it'll take some time for the heat to work its way through all of the thermal buffer. But then it has, and you're still pumping more heat into the system. And so the metal is getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And, a little bit more heat is being soaked up, but basically you now have you have now gotten past the point at which you have the thermal mass that buffers this heat, and now your temperatures are raising to the point where the metal gets soft. Because metal isn't just hard and then liquid. Metal gets softer and softer over time. You've got enormous forces going on, and the metal is getting softer, and now it starts to do things like deform, and the pistons become so hot, and the pistons and the cylinders become so hot and so on that they start deforming. And now it is really easy to get to the point where various things can happen, but essentially things aren't shaped the way they're supposed to anymore. You're slamming them at really high speed, shaped wrong. Things now start buckling, bending, and in really extreme cases, you can even fuse, get things jammed in such a way that, because of the heat, you can fuse things. Your engine completely seizes up and ceases to be an engine and becomes a very expensive, overly large paperweight. Now, this is a really excellent metaphor for what happens all over the place, where as you push yourself too hard, as you push something unsustainably, there will be a certain amount of buffer capacity built into any system that is capable of actually functioning, as you have to spread out the effects of the excess energy being used, essentially. And at which point now it starts to cause damage to things once essentially the buffering has been soaked up. And this is why for very short periods of time you can actually successfully dip into this sort of you can redline a car as you're accelerating as long as you back off pretty quickly, because the capacity of the thing to soak up heat will keep it from becoming too hot, and then you back off and you stop producing too much heat, and the coolant can successfully get the excess heat out of the system. Now, in general, you can for brief moments dip into excessive performance, because the system in general can absorb a bit of extra energy before it starts breaking, utterly breaking down. And then if you stop with that output and drop below your maximal output, now the systems which are supposed to recover will be able to recover from the little bit of excess. And, you may have a tiny bit of damage, you may have no damage depending. But this is where you see, the very dangerous things that, athletes do in pushing to super performance. This is also things like pulling an all-nighter to get a paper written. Classic thing for students, especially college students, to do is to pull that all-nighter, to wait too long, almost to the end, and then to just stay up all night using large amounts of caffeine to be able to stay awake, caffeine and adrenaline and what have you, and you don't get nearly enough sleep, but that's okay because you've gotten enough sleep for a bunch of nights before, and your brain isn't going to fall apart overnight. And so you're able to do better, actually, because of having this incredibly long thing, no distractions because everyone else is asleep, and you sort of are dipping into super performance by having this all-nighter, where just a confluence of your performance, everything together. You've been awake for a long time. You've been doing it recently, so you remember stuff fairly well. Stimulants are helping. No distractions. No one else is around. You can focus and concentrate. Nothing new is happening. No one's posting new videos or anything to distract you, etc. You do, and you can focus. You can do really well. You can actually get it. The stress, the adrenaline helps you to focus and concentrate, and you do a lot better than you would otherwise. But you pay for it by crashing. You get really tired for a few days after this. And if you actually sleep for several days after this, it can work. The very occasional doing of something like this can work. What this does, though, and where this gets seductive, is when it's something a little bit less immediate than the sleep thing. Because very few people can actually make it sound like a good idea to go without sleep night after night after night. Because about the only way to do that's cocaine, so far as I'm aware. I've read that cocaine works, never tried this stuff myself. But, and just as a fun little side note, I researched it for a murder mystery, as considering it as a murder weapon. Ended up not going that way, went with heroin instead as the murder weapon. But kind of fascinating is that the way that cocaine tends to ruin your life is not its side effects, but its primary effect. It's a stimulant. It's an incredibly powerful stimulant. And it makes going to sleep optional. The problem is it doesn't make sleeping optional. Your brain just keeps on, if you don't go to sleep, your brain keeps deteriorating. And if you are taking cocaine during this time, you don't feel tired at all. You don't feel like going to sleep at all, but you still deteriorate. You still start making the incredibly bad decisions that an incredibly sleep-deprived person makes, only you've got a ton of energy to follow through on these really, really awful decisions. So, it's actually really fascinating how that works. That one is genuinely a tangent, though. So other than, using cocaine in order to never sleep, you really kind of have to sleep. It's you can't put sleep off for months. It's not avoidable in that fashion. Even with cocaine, from what I gather, at least from what I've read, you can't really go more than about a week without sleeping. Even on cocaine, at some point you're just going to straight up shut down, or because cocaine doesn't last all that long. It only is, what is it, half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that, I think. And then it starts to wear off. And at some point, you'll like miss taking a bit more for a few minutes. And then the fact that you are insanely tired will hit you pretty fast and you'll just fall asleep. So, my understanding is you can't, even with something like cocaine, you can't run yourself to that point of just dying from lack of sleep. And so, so nobody really is pushing that sort of lifestyle. But things that last longer than that, things where you don't just no matter what crash within a few days, you do see people running those for way, way too long. And then by only catching glimpses of this, whether it's social media or otherwise, reading about biography, reading people reporting on it or biographies or what have you, you sort of see, oh, they did this to get these amazing results, and they won these medals and they got these great things. This must be the way to do it. And nobody has to tell you it's the way to do it. It just is a natural intuition that when you're looking for how do you really get the best performance, oh, well, this person was doing this and got the best performance. And you don't get the whole picture. And intrinsically, the best performance will always come from something unsustainable, because you can have those buffer areas which can soak up all of the unsustainable problem for a short time. And some things can be fairly long, like never reading any books, never having any serious important conversations, not growing as a human being from the age of about 17. This is sustainable for years. The problem is, if you really get into hardcore partying and you happen to have tremendous musical talent, say, going back to the pop star example, you can more or less freeze in place, and that sort of perpetual youth is kind of acceptable into your mid-20s at least. By the time you start hitting your late 20s, the fact that you really are kind of basically like a 17-year-old, you don't know anything. For the most part, 17-year-olds don't. You haven't thought anything 17-year-olds haven't. You have no wisdom that a 17-year-old doesn't have. You're going to start having trouble getting along with people your own age at this point. The way you've just been stuck, the way you've been doing nothing but partying and having fun and, also making music. And, and presumably practicing at music. And so, you'll gain a little bit. You can't literally freeze yourself in time. But that sort of thing is sustainable for years, and then it starts to catch up with you. The fact that nobody can have an intelligent conversation with you because you have nothing intelligent to say on any subject. And this comes up on occasion when you see, especially the moderate-aged, pop stars, when they do interviews and you look at them and... as Todd in the Shadow once said, their really deep thoughts are like, war's bad, and I don't like bad things. If that's all you have to offer, you don't have anything more to offer than a rock. And the thing is, you can get away with this when you're young. People don't expect that much of you when you're young. But if you never actually do all of the work of learning that stuff, if you don't do all of those things, at some point, people lose interest in you because you've got nothing to offer anymore. So that's probably the most seductive, when you have that sort of range of, it looks good for a while, you can get away with it for a number of years. And where you see this, again, because, I've never had to turn down a career as a pop star. It just never has come up for some strange reason. Possibly what with me not actually being a talented musician, supremely talented musician, etc. And, I wasn't half bad when I took piano lessons when I was 11. But I mean, I was never anything that anyone was going to go and pay money to listen to. Now, I never had to do that, but where this really becomes pernicious is when people look at this and figure there's some sort of promise there. And then they compare that to the other promises of life, like putting in the time and effort in things like having a family, putting in the time and effort of things like religious devotions, putting in the time and effort of just reading books and improving yourself, improving your knowledge, improving your understanding, gaining wisdom, things like this. All of these things, you will see people who see sort of the siren call of oh, here is the way to happiness. This other stuff, that's hard, that's unpleasant, that's a lot of work. And that doesn't really, I don't see the same sort of happiness as, the Instagram pictures of, the pop singer who's just having such a wonderful time, and, they're whatevering at each other, commenting on each other's posts, tweeting at each other, whatever. They're all friends, they're having a great time, they know the most interesting people, they have the best parties. Everything here is so great. That's the real happiness. Like, they have the key to happiness, not this other stuff. And so what does a person do? It's not that they go pursue that life of like doing lots of drugs and trying to be a rock star. I mean, occasionally people do. There are a decent number of actors who only ever wait tables. There are a decent number of, of singer-songwriters who wait tables. And so on. Like, it happens. It does happen. People join bands, they live on almost nothing, they have little side jobs that are terrible, they don't build up any skills, they don't... that's another thing, too. Your life is a lot better if you build up skills and get good at having a trade of some kind. Whether it's carpentry or being I'm a programmer, that's my trade, or, plumbing, being an electrician, being a manager of, in an office. They're real skills. There are a lot of skills involved in being a decent manager. It's not an easy job at all, and there are a ton of bad managers. So, like, being a good manager, or, being an accountant, or any number of things. All of these things are trades. They're the thing you do to earn your living. Getting good at a trade, being good at a trade, so that, like, you're actually way more skilled at this than a person who's been doing it for 6 months, that actually makes your life when you're in your 40s a lot better. So, like, developing those sorts of skills so that you're actually good at something, such that, when you're getting older, you can be somebody that people will respect because you're good at what you do, also is going to help you a lot. It doesn't make you smile all the time, as you're working away, however exactly you work, like, maybe you whistle while you work. Maybe not. You're probably not, like, just sitting there with a giant grin on your face the entire time. You're not, giggling and laughing because, like, that's not how people normally are for normal events. And, like, taking lots of drugs during work is a bad idea. You're not going to actually get good at anything if you're high all the time. And so, the point is, all of these things, though very good ideas and conducive to happiness, and much of what I'm talking about, by the way, are subordinate goods. I want to be clear, like, getting good at your job is a subordinate good. There are much more important things in life, but this is one of the things that you should be doing to for longer term happiness. It needs to be understood to be a subordinate good, or it too will lead to misery. Of course, that's true of all subordinate goods, so bear that in mind. But the point is, even among subordinate goods, it's really easy to look at this stuff and think, like, that person looks so happy. They look like they're having such a great time. All these other people who aren't doing that sort of stuff and are doing this sort of long-term thing, building for the future, developing skills, learning, praying, and other things, less of a still a subordinate good, higher up subordinate good. All these things, they're not smiling all the time. They're not posting Instagram photos of how happy they are. It doesn't look like this. Like, they're just doing ordinary stuff. They're not having the, like, amazing times. And they're not. And so, it's not that the person will then pursue the amazing times necessarily, but the real problem is when they fail to pursue the other stuff because they think of it as, like, that's not really going to make me happy. I don't know what will. This is usually how it goes. Not like, oh, I'm going to go be a pop star. But rather, I don't know, that stuff doesn't make you happy, clearly, because, like, it's way lower than this stuff. I don't know what does make you happy. I'm just going to go get wasted. Colloquial for getting very drunk, by the way. Just because you might not have the same... I don't know who's watching these videos, right? And people watch these videos from outside the United States, and so you may not have the same slang. But in any event, they'll, go drink a large amount of alcohol and get very drunk to forget all of their problems. This is what get wasted means in that context. Anyway, so the The thing there, and that is where I think the really big problem of these unsustainable things being seductive is it's not that they're so seductive that you go and try it. To some degree, as long as it's not one of the really long-term things, and as long as you're going to survive, because, like, if you try shooting several grams of steroids in order to, get super, super big and super jacked, and end up, like, destroying your heart and dying, okay, you're not going to learn any lessons there. But assuming you survive and assuming you don't waste, like, decades of your life on this stuff, if you actually go and try, you may well find out that, like, it actually is not anything like what it was supposed to be pretty darn fast. And then move on with your life. So that may, in fact, actually be better. Where it really gets worst, where it really is at its worst, where it's most destructive, is when a person won't go for that and they won't go for the other things. They're seduced enough to not commit, but they're also not seduced enough to even give it a try. You can occasionally see this in teenagers, I think. You'll see I've seen it in person, specifically, where there's a guy who sort of had a crush on this beautiful, popular girl who he never talked to and who wouldn't particularly talk to him. But because he sort of had this crush on her, he wouldn't talk to a girl who actually was interested in him and who he would have liked and who he would have gotten along with. Nothing's guaranteed in this life. There's a pretty good chance as things in this world go. It's kind of, I'm not going to use any of the names or specific details, but, like, I remember it, and it was kind of curious that, like, because he was seduced by this ideal, not ideal in, like, a real sense of ideal, but because he was seduced by something that just seemed more attractive to him, he neither went for it, nor did he go for something realistic, something that was actually attainable. He kind of just didn't do either of those things. And so that is a good metaphor for where the problem in this really lies. That people, you can say it. I did a video about the perfect being the enemy of the good. You can use that phrase for this, where they let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's in no sense the perfect, actually, in this case. But where, by being seduced by something that is unattainable, they don't try for that, and nor do they try for anything that actually would bring them happiness. And so they just sort of drift along miserable, not making any choices because they're seduced by something that they can't get and don't even try for. And that's really the most pernicious aspect of that. This is sort of the worst case of it all. And it's something to always be on your guard for, because it's always there to varying degrees. You will, especially in modern times, you'll always see, people who are at the height of whatever it is. I mean, even if it's just like the people who, like, wrote the best knitting books, even if your hobby is knitting, you will be exposed to some really amazing knitting. And, and moreover, you'll be exposed to, like, people who taught knitting extremely well in knitting books. I mean, whatever it is. Now, those aren't necessarily, writing a knitting book is not necessarily an unsustainable thing. But whatever the heck you're doing, you're going to see people, you will find people who have a lot more disposable income than you do to buy yarn. So, in my days knitting are coming back. I haven't knit in a while. Young children and knitting do not go along well. They're worse than, from what I've heard, cats are like, because they just mess everything up. And also, I've just had no time to, like, sit down and knit. I kind of figure, like, once they're teenagers, or maybe in their 20s, I'll finally be able to do something like sit down and watch a movie and knit at the time. Anyway, but when you're knitting, you have nice fabrics, but they're always, like, extremely expensive yarns that you can have. And there are people who do go and buy these extremely expensive yarns. And sometimes, they're just really well off. Like, that one can simply be solved by being rich, because, no one knits with, like, gold. So, so it varies a little bit, but kind of no matter what you're doing, there'll always be these things that, at least for you, would be unsustainable. And they will always sort of give you this sort of siren call of, like, oh, look at how great this other thing is. Look at how wonderful. And it's very hard, but very necessary to be realistic about it and to think through, like, okay, how much happiness would that actually bring me? And for how long? How long could I do this? And what problems would happen because of it? Could I keep on doing that? And, that's a general thing. And the answer generally is sometimes like, oh, no, it's a good idea. Like, you know, starting the day off with a few prayers, like spending, 3 minutes in the morning saying morning prayer. That's not unsustainable. That's very sustainable. And, you think about it, like, what are the benefits? Well, like, it'll, help me to structure my day. It'll help me to, get in the right frame of mind to, as I'm waking up, to focus on what's really important. And then, what are the downsides? Well, any habit you're getting into takes time to get into a habit, takes effort to get into a habit. And it'll take about 3 minutes. It's not very expensive, worth doing. So like not everything comes out, to be unsustainable. Some things are really good. Now, a version of this might be like, the round of prayers that monks have. And could I do the round of prayers that monks have? I doubt it. I mean, they do. It's not literally impossible for me. But when I think through, just the various things that I have to do, the round of prayer, I mean, so like, look at like the Benedictine monks, the round of prayer they have is impressive. And I mean, they do work, like they get work done, but part of what allows them to do this is the fact that they don't marry. They are all, they have no children, they have no wives. And so they're able to do this. Or, Benedictine nuns have no husbands and no children. They don't have these young people around who need them on a semi-constant basis. And so could I do it? No, not really. I mean, in some super technical sense, yeah. But in a realistic sense, no. Like, I could not sustain that. And this is the reason why there are sometimes things like retreats, where people go and spend a few days in a Benedictine monastery when, everyone else covers for them. Because for a few days, you can cover for somebody, not a big deal. And you live that sort of life for a few days, and it can help you in all sorts of various ways. And then you come back strengthened by your time doing this to do better. So like, sometimes unsustainable things can be very useful in small doses when you're realistic and are doing them that way. Like I said about vacations, sometimes vacations are good. So the thing about it in all cases is to be realistic about how long can I do this for, and what will happen when I do? What are the benefits when I do? What are the downsides of what I'll do? How much of this will carry over until after it? How much am I just sacrificing for the moment versus making a sacrifice for something that will then help me for a long time? Like I put a few weekends into building my tool shed, and it was a sacrifice of a whole bunch of hours that I wasn't doing other things. But now I have a tool shed for many years that will help me to be able to use my table saw and my miter saw and to be able to do other projects much faster. Now that I have ready access to them, and they can be kept, free from rust and safe and so on. And so, there, the sacrifice of time bought something for a long time. And so is it sustainable? Could I, build tool sheds every weekend? No. Like, I that would not work in my life, but for a short time it is. And so, again, it's things like, and I see the siren call of having like a real proper woodworking shop, a nice big shop with power outlets everywhere and a miter saw that's actually built into the table, and the table saw with the permanent roller set up, and, lots of space and all of the tools, already set up and already like ready to go, and, a shop vac dust collection system. I see the siren call of that. Like, man, that would be wonderful. Not realistic for me, so I can't go there, and I need to focus on what can I actually do. What can I do with the tools that I do have? Which tools occasionally might make sense to get? Where can I keep all of this stuff because I don't have that much space, etc. And so, again, it's all about being realistic about how long is the benefit for, and how much does this benefit really cost, and how sustainable is this thing, and what are the things that I can do that actually do have long-term benefits and are sustainable, and so on. And so that's really, these come to prudential judgments, which involve all of the specifics. There are no general rules for like what is the right thing for you to do, and a professional carpenter will have a very different answer on that woodworking shop than will I. Because, for a professional carpenter, this is a lot more sustainable for obvious reasons. So again, it's there. My conclusion is not about like, oh, always resist going for, the biggest or the best or something. That would be stupid. I don't have a simple conclusion like that, unfortunately. The conclusion really is that about everything, be aware that you will always be seduced by unsustainable things. Don't let that become the enemy of sustainable things. And at the same time, don't be afraid of unsustainable things if they have long-term benefits and can be done in such a way that you can't sustain them, but you don't have to sustain them. And you're not building your life around sustaining the unsustainable, that you only do unsustainable things for short times in ways that you can soak up. Like where, you can call in some favors and people will help watch your kids for a day. That's unsustainable, but on the other hand, maybe it works out well. It can work for a day, and that's fine if you can do something for that day that will then have some like actual longer term benefits than, one day. So, yeah, that's the problem with unsustainable things, that they're intrinsically seductive, but at the same time, they're not intrinsically bad. They can be good if used in the right sort of way and so on. And so that's really the conclusion. Use them the right way. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.